Hello and welcome back to another episode of the ShefF1 Podcast on the back of a pretty roller coaster-esque Australian Grand Prix weekend. While the race itself wasn't exactly a classic, we have loads to talk about in this episode. I'm Rudy Blunt-Brown and joining me is Seb Alston and Amy Hammerslog, and we've got pretty much an hour of Australian GP chat coming your way. Seb, did you enjoy the race weekend? It was, like I said before, it wasn't the most riveting Sunday, but one to definitely remember over the course of the season, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think obviously having a new race winner this season, it's something that I don't think either of us expected going into it this weekend. Yeah, it wasn't like an all-time classic in terms of the racing on track, but I think in terms of just the excitement around Max DNFing for like the first time in 2 years, actually having a different leader and having some good battles at times on track. Obviously, loads of incidents to delve into, the Albon Sargeant thing, George Russell and Alonso. There's a lot to talk about and a lot to go into. Obviously, again, being Australia, actually having to get up that early wasn't nice, and actually I did miss it, but I have watched it back in full. So yeah, it was decent and it was good. Even though waking up and knowing that I'd missed the race, but waking up and seeing that there was a different race winner it was decent.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you that chose not to wake up, because I can imagine most of our fans are from the UK, so those of you that chose not to wake up at 4 a.m. to watch the Australian Grand Prix, you know what, I can't blame you, because it was a bit of a slogfest. But if you did miss it, Max Verstappen did retire very early into the race, giving us a new race winner for this season, that is Carlos Sainz. Must be the first non-Max Verstappen winner since his previous victory in Singapore, if I'm not mistaken, and Max Verstappen's first DNF since Australia 2022. So quite sort of symbolic, that retirement, really. And Amy, I mean, were you sort of as excited as half of social media was when Max's car did end up giving out, I think on lap 2, was it?
Yeah, I was, definitely. I mean, don't get me wrong, I wanted a driver to win without Max having to DNF. But no, I loved the podium. I mean, it was my top 3 favourite drivers, so that was perfect. But yeah, I did wake up the house when Max DNF'd. It was more of shock. I don't ever want to wish on a driver's downfall, but it was pretty nice, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, I mean, I for some reason, even though I nodded off at around 2 a.m, just because it was the sort of first nice evening I'd had at home for quite some time, because obviously we're all uni students back home for Easter. And so I don't know why I fell asleep. I should have just stayed up. Is that Barkley in the background?
Yeah,
Yeah, for some reason, even though I went to sleep sort of quite late anyway, I only gave myself around 2 hours of kip, and so I probably just stayed up for the whole thing, because when Max, when the car did start sort of smoking and setting on fire, I was like, is this really happening? I had to sort of rub my eyes and sort of properly comprehend what was going on. It was a bit of a roller coaster because I sort of kept on drifting in and out of sleep. I have obviously, like Seb, watched the race back, and I do have, I think, valid opinions on this race, despite the fact that I was sort of drifting in and out of consciousness for the whole thing at real time. But from one minute it was the bloke from Dude Perfect in a Ferrari unitard, next minute Max Verstappen's pulling into the pits on lap 2 with his car on fire.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, when Carlos Sainz overtook him, I was like, is something going on here? I didn't know if genuinely the Ferraris were quick enough, and then Max said on the radio, I've lost the car. I didn't know, and then he went, oh, the car's loose, and then he started going into the pits and there was an explosion. So I don't know if the actual overtake was genuine or the car was just falling apart already at that point.
Well, Christian Horner described it basically, I think it was Christian Horner, described it as, okay, while F1 cars don't have a handbrake, it was a brake caliper issue that was as though the car was driving around with the handbrake sort of slightly on, meaning that obviously your speed isn't going to be as quick as you'd once think it was, and obviously it affected the right rear brake caliper the most, and it eventually just set on fire because it was loads of unnecessary pressure being added onto it, and and that's you can't. If people were wondering if Max could have carried on with that, no, absolutely not. It was an issue that could not have been resolved without fully retiring the car. So yeah, pretty sloppy on Red Bull's part as well, because from what I've read and what I've listened to, it sounds like an issue that just comes at the price of complacency. Maybe not complacency, but it's something that a team really shouldn't have to contend with going into the Sunday, especially if the car was it took a little while for them to find the right setup for qualifying, but they looked fine going into Sunday. Max in particular with a 3/10 of a second gap to Carlos Sainz in in second place, Seb. A lot of people said that regardless of Max's sort of engine issues, Carlos was going to win the race anyway. Would you agree with that? Was his pace strong enough to stay ahead?
I think it's super hard to tell because obviously it was so early in the race. Obviously, you look at Sergio Perez as maybe a comparison, but we know that Verstappen is quicker than Perez anyway. And I think it came out afterwards that apparently Perez had floor damage. I'm not sure how true that is and how much that actually affected his performance, or whether he's just done a Perez. But I genuinely do think that Verstappen still would have had enough to take home the victory. I think that, as I said in our predictions, I couldn't imagine at this moment in time Verstappen getting past. And I know we did see him get past, but yeah, it still feels like Verstappen is on another level. And I do think that he still would have had enough. Not to say that Sainz didn't maximise the performance of the Ferrari, and the Ferrari didn't have a good weekend. Of course it did, and of course it was competitive. But yeah, we'll never know for certain. But I do think that ultimately the Red Bull probably could have been quicker, but who knows?
I mean, when you qualify 3/10 quicker of the man who then ended up going on and winning the race, obviously without the mechanical issues that he was having on Sunday, it looks as though that, despite Carlos's convincing overtake very early into the race, it was, purely down to the fact that the car was broken. But needless to say, it was an excellent drive from Carlos Sainz to put it on the top step of the podium, despite the fact that he had his appendix out just 16 days prior, and that was obviously the big talking point going into the weekend. Was he ready? And from what he was saying, he was saying after his first week of recovery, he was like, "Oh no, don't think I'll be able to do this." And then once he'd arrived in Australia, I don't think he did that Sunday on 100%, which is scary for Charles Leclerc. If that wasn't Carlos Sainz at his very best, then a really impressive drive nonetheless. And that's the kind of drive that puts the whole paddock on notice as well. I think all drivers definitely have a target on their backs now, given that Carlos Sainz is one of many drivers, with no guaranteed seat for next year. And of course, with the unpredictability of the regulation changes in 2026, who knows what teams are going to come out on top in just 2 years' time. And so Carlos Sainz, every driver really has to be sort of thinking, okay, is my seat in jeopardy here? Much like the situation in which Carlos was just shunted out of Ferrari, with no prior warning. It's drives like that which sort of prove how good a driver Carlos is. And while since we've sort of started this podcast, the genuine notion is that, we feel as though Leclerc is a stronger driver and is more likely to provide a world championship for Ferrari in the coming years. Obviously, that is definitely the case now because Carlos won't be driving for them anymore. But, it's maybe we've underestimated him this whole time. Those drives that we saw in the back end of last season, and even this year, he hasn't looked too bad, especially, obviously, after Australia, it was a brilliant drive. But yeah, definitely a drive to put the whole paddock on notice. Amy, what did you think of Carlos's performance over the weekend?
Yeah, it was incredible. I'm genuinely a little bit upset that he's going as a Ferrari fan. I think Ferrari are shaking their heads massively because, you look at Lewis's race compared to Carlos's, and I don't want to put disrespect on a 7-time world champion's name here, but is he washed? Is he going to be able? Is he going to be able to come to Ferrari?
The W word on ShefF1, washed is just.
I just think, is he able to come Ferrari and do a job like Carlos Sainz? He's the only other race winner in that's not Red Bull in the last 500 days, something like that. And
where have you read that? That's a great stat.
It was literally specifically 500 days. Obviously Max and Checo, the other two, but yeah, he's the only other driver to do it. And drivers like Charles Leclerc and Lando Norris should have been really taking advantage of this. And obviously they didn't have as good as qualifying as Carlos, but that's where you've got to take your opportunities, and they didn't, and Carlos did. And Ferrari, for me, will have to be shaking their heads because now Red Bull are looking at him. Carlos Sainz, apparently it's come out and they said he's a very attractive option for them going into next year. And I'm sure Carlos would love the potential of that. But for me as a Charles Leclerc fan, more so than Carlos, even though I love them both, but I find that even more upsetting if Carlos was to go to Red Bull from Ferrari, because he may actually be able to fight for a championship, and we're going to see Charles stuck at Ferrari, and potentially they might not be able to get to the levels of Red Bull not until at least 2026 onwards. So, yeah, I think the potential for Carlos, doors are going to open from now. one race can make all the difference, and he took his opportunity, and he did well with it. So yeah, I'm proud of him. I was proud of him.
Yeah, I mean, people making up all sorts of excuses like weight reduction, given the appendix coming out. But no, I mean, the big three team principals, i.e. Toto Wolff, Fred Vasseur and Christian Horner, all sort of spoke about Carlos in rather different ways. Toto Wolff did a very sort of, good sort of politician-type answer of not really making too much reference to him when he was questioned about his driver lineup for 2025. Christian Horner was very much on the opposite end of the scale and was hugely complimentary of Carlos and the drive that he put in over the weekend, stressing that, he was asked about Yuki Tsunoda's performance and how he's been at the start of this season, and he flipped the question totally on its head and said, look, this isn't just about the drivers that we've got in the Red Bull sort of talent pool. This is about who the best fit will be to drive alongside Max for the foreseeable future. And obviously, making big reference to how well Carlos performed this weekend. And then Fred Vasseur sort of in the middle of the other two team principals sort of saying, yeah, great drive from Carlos. But then obviously he's going to get more and more questions that sort of, will ask him, well, do you regret maybe getting rid of him? So he downplayed his weekend a little bit. Let's loop back to the man that is replacing him at Ferrari, Seb, Lewis Hamilton. Talk to us more about his weekend, because it was certainly underwhelming from the 7-time world champ.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken about it before. Again, another weekend where he seems to get the setup wrong in qualifying, and that just hampers his entire weekend. I have no idea what's going on. I think you look back last year, he finished third in the championship. He was clearly at a decent level. I mean, decent enough for Ferrari to go out and replace Carlos Sainz with him. 2022, he was a bit down and he was playing around with strategies and setups and things like that. You thought this year, you'd want to go out on a high with Mercedes, but it just seems like either he's lacking motivation, he's seen that the Mercedes this year isn't up to scratch, and it just seems like he doesn't really care that much, and it's not promising for them going forward. It's not promising for Hamilton, it's not promising for Ferrari, but this weekend, obviously, getting knocked out in Q2 is not a good look at all, especially when you think of it, an RB got into Q3 in Tsunoda, Lance Stroll getting into Q3, obviously his teammate getting into Q3, and Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, can't do it. Yeah, that's really poor. Obviously, the DNF, we'll never know how he'd have actually got on in the race. Maybe he could have, recovered and got to, to a decent position. Obviously, there was opportunities for that with the strategy, with the VSC and things like that. We don't know how he would have done. But either way, another really poor weekend for Hamilton. And I just don't see how he recovers it this season. He's not going to have much motivation because, does he really care about developing the car going forward? Probably not, because he's not going to be there. Doesn't really need to put himself in the shop window. He's already got a contract for the next 2 years. So, I think that it could be a really underwhelming end to the season for him.
Yeah, no, you summed it up pretty well there. This definitely seems like a throwaway season for Lewis Hamilton, and his attitude shows that. It's a case of when we look back to sort of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, very sort of comical with his sort of with his interview answers, very upbeat, despite the fact that more could have been extracted from each race weekend. And then Australia, a bit of a calamity, failing to make Q3 when his teammate and slower cars did, and obviously a mechanical DNF at the towards the beginning of the Grand Prix as well, and he was just really subdued in his interview answers. He a lot of one-word answers, a lot of attitude from him. But you're right, the motivation definitely isn't there anymore. It's a case of, Mercedes have been promising, we'll make the right steps back forward, we'll be the Mercedes of old, we'll be the Mercedes that gave him all of his, well, not all of his, but a majority of his world championships. And to be fair, they haven't delivered on that promise. They've made changes at the top, they've made radical changes to the car, they've trying everything, but nothing seems to be working out. So I can't blame Lewis for making the jump, but it isn't right. A driver of his etiquette, a driver of his standard, to be sort of just tossing this season away, it's not fair on the team who he is also abandoning. I think it's pretty poor from Lewis in that regard. But he can also sort of just do what he wants because he is arguably, in my eyes anyway, the greatest driver in F1 history. But we'll talk about his teammate now, George Russell, who had a fairly solid race up until a sort of hugely scrutinised part of the weekend, Amy. Have you seen the incident that Fernando Alonso was given 20 seconds worth of penalties for? Obviously, they were both fighting for P6 on the final lap. George was quicker, and then Fernando Alonso in P6 was given a 20-second time penalty after the race to suffice for a drive-through because of reckless driving. What do you make of that whole situation?
Yeah, I think 20 seconds is very what's the word? What's the word I'm looking
Harsh.
for? Harsh, yeah. I think it's harsh, and I think don't get me wrong, it did look like maybe a bit of a break. 20 seconds, where's that come from? Is there a set
It's to
rule?
suffice for a drive-through. So obviously, if you
Right.
give the penalty out at the end of the race, then you can't obviously make a driver drive through the pits one lap
Yeah,
while
yeah,
everyone
yeah,
else is
yeah.
doing racing speed. So they gave him a 20 seconds as that is sort of the most accurate and round sort of timed penalty that they can give out.
But the incident was very scary. That
Mm.
is definitely for sure. Like, George was just in the middle of. I don't know why they didn't red flag it. I don't know if they just wanted to get the race,
Yeah.
done. And obviously it was quite a scary radio call where
Mm.
George was like, red flag, red flag. And like, if anyone was going high speed just behind them, then that's a very dangerous situation to be in, if not fatal. So, yeah, it was not a nice situation for George to be in. But for me, and so people were saying, whenever Carlos Sainz is leading in front, George Russell always likes to DNF. He must not like to see Carlos Sainz win. But yeah, no, I don't. I don't know if I'm going to say something too controversial here.
No,
I don't
say.
think he's well, I don't think Mercedes are good enough to have that standard, but typical Mercedes, I don't think he's good enough at the minute, George Russell. I think to where Toto Wolff and that team wants to be. I think, even though there's a spare seat for next year for Mercedes, I think George Russell should watch his back a little as well. I don't think he should feel comfortable because, yeah, even though his teammate in Lewis Hamilton is not performing to his standard, I don't think George Russell, and I think a car's a lot to blame for that, but I don't think he's been good enough either. So I think, yeah,
I think
should
you're
be
being a little
careful.
harsh there. I think it was a solid. Yeah, Seb's nodded his head there as well. I think it was a solid first two race weekends for him in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, respectively. But I wouldn't say that he was at fault. It wasn't a driver error that caused that crash. Obviously, I don't think, maybe because I'm not a true expert here, but I don't think Fernando's driving was, the most at fault. I don't know how to put it. Maybe he was too harshly penalised, but obviously it was very much sort of, this is what the rule says, so this is how we penalise him. But one thing I could maybe sort of try and compromise an agreement with you on here is that if the Mercedes was a more drivable car, maybe that incident could have been avoided. Because obviously, sure, okay, Fernando brake checked him, and a lot of drivers in that situation could have just lost control of the car. But it looked as though that there was a lot of turbulent air that caused the Mercedes and its poor downforce to lose control. Seb, what did you make of the incident? Are you agreeing with Amy in saying that it was mostly driver error?
I don't actually. I think obviously there is in part driver error, but I do think considering the circumstances, I actually think Amy said it was harsh. I think it's arguably you could say it's lenient. I think if you're doing something like that, I think that's on the edge of disqualification sort of thing. Like you're putting a driver at such high risk by brake checking them into a high speed corner. I know it's not the highest speed corner, but still that is on a like half street circuit sort of thing. That is so dangerous, and I think I think it's awful from Alonso. I think obviously we don't know the data fully, and obviously Alonso's come out and defended himself and said that it's part of racing and things like that, and obviously braking earlier into corners and things like that is part of racing. But it's come out that it's like 100 meters. He's braked early, come off the gas. And when you look at the footage comparing his, the lap before, how he took that turn and, how he took it on the lap where the incident happened, it does seem quite obvious that it was intentional and he knew what he was doing. Now, I doubt I'm not going to say he tried to harm Russell. I don't think he did. I do think he tried to make Russell, off balance sort of thing like that. And I think that maybe his intention wasn't to harm, as I said there, but I do think that it's a little bit like, this is such a weird comparison, but like sort of like manslaughter sort of thing. Like your actions, even if you don't intend them to do something, if they have a possibility of that happening, you should still get punished for it. And I do think that, I think Alonso should have. I think the penalty was probably fair in the end. I could see an argument that it was arguably lenient because at the end of the day, Russell might not have walked away, And also, on a points level, I mean, it did ruin his race. Yes, he maybe, if he was a little bit more alert, whatever, could have avoided it. But still, I do think it was, I'm definitely on the side that Alonso should have been punished for it.
Let's just make it abundantly clear that Seb does not think Alonso should be charged with attempted manslaughter. That even is a criminal charge. But let us know in the comments down below if you sort of agree with Seb, Amy, or myself, or you have your own sort of completely unique opinion on the matter. Because obviously this is an incident that caused big sort of polarising debate online, and Fernando himself came out with a huge paragraph with his sort of social media post reflecting on the weekend, and sort of saying that he didn't deserve it. Obviously the driver's going to 9 times out of 10 come out and say, yeah, I've been wrongly penalised here. But it was pretty dangerous. Looking at the clip itself, it didn't, like, when I first saw it, I was like 20 seconds does seem a little harsh. But yeah, like when you put it into the sort of context, Seb, it wasn't particularly, I don't know how to put it, sportsmanlike from Alonso. It was risky. It was a risky move. But one thing I think he did allude to was the fact that if it wasn't a gravel trap and it was just like an escape road there instead, the incident wouldn't have been as sort of seismic, which is an interesting spin to take on it. But I think he is just trying to change the subject slightly there. I
mean, you do have to think, like, if Russell hadn't crashed out at all, if he had caught it or whatever, like, would it have been penalised? I don't think so, and I think that's on the FIA. I still think it should be punished, because you look at, there was an incident obviously with Alonso and Hamilton last year where Alonso brake tested Hamilton. Obviously Hamilton was able to catch it, sort of thing, and react. But yeah, I think they now have set a precedent where if you do that, you need to get punished, whether or not. It's a bit like football where where you have to dive essentially to get penalties, because they don't give decisions if there isn't this big reaction. I think that's what the FIA have sort of done here. You kind of have to crash if there's going to be any punishment, which is not how it should be, because otherwise, if they penalised Alonso for brake testing Hamilton earlier, I think it was last year in Abu Dhabi, then would Alonso have done the same thing this weekend? Probably not. So I do think I think it's a little bit on the FIA as well.
I mean, Alonso came out after it and was being interviewed like in the media pen, and he was saying like he was struggling with the car, there was a lot going on with it, and that's why Russell was catching up to him, and that he needed to brake before the corner. So that was his defence, is that he weren't brake testing, he genuinely was trying to cope with the car.
If it was any other driver, and this is no disrespect to Fernando Alonso, but this is a man that comes up with all sorts of ways to defend his position, no matter what it is. If it's the race win, if it's P6, even if it was for P19, he would sort of, go hammer and nail. He would do anything he can to maintain his position. And so he's very good at drafting up excuses, Fernando, but that's why I love him so much, really. But yeah, carry on.
I'm just trusting Alonso. That's I'm just taking fully Alonso's side here.
But one final thing on this matter as well. Should they have called the red flag out? We'll sort of have a yes or no, because they did call out the VSC and there was no further incidents, but George Russell was very panicky on the radio. So I'll give you some time to think, but on 3, let's just sort of say, should it have been red flag or not? 1, 2, 3, no.
Yeah.
Maybe. I'm a bit unsure, because obviously there was quite a big gap to Stroll, who was behind, and there was 1 lap left, sort of thing. They were on the final lap, so. But again, he was in the middle of the track. It depends. I think obviously if they'd been closer, red flag immediately, sort of thing. They were slow even to call the VSC though, so I do think that was still an error from the FIA. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but I can understand why it could have been a red flag immediately.
I think the admin side of things and this, it would have been very, I suppose, drastic to call out a full safety car or a red flag on the last lap. It would have been a lot to sort of, it would have been really confusing as well, I think.
Yeah.
Would they have to restart the lap? Would they have just, called the results at the end of lap 57, whatever happened there, sort of thing?
At that point, would Russell have got points? I'm not sure, because I don't even know what the precedent is, because obviously there was that thing in was it Silverstone a couple of years ago, Melbourne last year. No one had any idea what was going on, because it's just the FIA was sort of a mess of a rule book sort of thing. So yeah, that would have been interesting. Obviously that should never be put before, though. Admin work should never, paperwork shouldn't be put before someone's life, though. But I could understand why, if it wasn't a risk and Stroll was far enough back that he would have had a lot of time to react, then I can see why they didn't. But
I think safety should just come first, though. Sometimes that's why I said like at the time, I think it was the drivers coped well with the virtual safety car and was able to get around it. But God forbid, someone was just behind them. Stroll was only a second behind and wasn't able to react fast enough, and there was nowhere safe for him to go right or left. He might have ended up crashing into a wall himself or gone into the back of Russell. Do I think a red flag would have stopped that from happening?
No, probably not, would it?
No. But still, I heard Stroll's radio when that happened, and the mechanics, the engineers were on the radio very quick, being slow down. He should be able to tell that from the flags, and if they didn't think he was going to pick that up from yellow flags, then red flags you're going to stop straight away. So, I just think safety-wise, because that just would have been awful to see if anyone had been behind. No one wants to see that happening. So
it was dealt with very well by the drivers and the teams. Russell was very quick on the radio. Of course, Aston Martin were quick on the radio to Lance Stroll as well. I'm only saying no, obviously, with the gift of hindsight. It was fine in the end, just calling the VSC, and it would have been very controversial if they were to have called a red flag and then, use the previous lap's results to determine it, or maybe one full lap of racing action with the standing
start. That would be
start.
So exciting. But it would have been behind the safety car, I think.
A one-lap sprint race. But, they were starting to probably run over time a little bit. It would have been a real sort of pain in the backside with all the admin and stuff like that, and it would have been scrutinised nonetheless. I think they went with the safest decision in terms of backlash. Not a lot of people are sort of campaigning for the red flag to have came out. Obviously, it's all happened now, and no one's since been hurt, obviously, by just calling out the VSC. But it would have been pretty sick to sort of restart the lap and have one sprint race. But then I think George would have been pretty hard done by there, not being able to have that opportunity to partake in that. But VSC was called. No one else got hurt. George Russell walked out away from the incident okay. And then Fernando got given a penalty, which sent him down to, I think, P8, was it?
Yeah.
So, even not particularly damning for Fernando, really, considering, that Aston Martin didn't look too quick. He was outperformed by Lance Stroll as well, who had a fairly respectable weekend, come the end of the Grand Prix. Not too much to write home about, of course, apart from out-qualifying Fernando, despite the fact that I predicted him to have an absolute howler in qualifying, so he's made me look a bit of a fool there. But, some positive signs, I think, from the driver's point of view in Aston Martin, particularly on Stroll's end. But, the car was pretty underwhelming for the whole weekend. So it was a controversial weekend in many regards down under, and one of the sort of big ones that really kicked off the weekend was that Logan Sargeant would not be participating in qualifying or for the race due to an incident caused by Alex Albon. So, can someone remind me which practice session it was where Albon basically just binned it? FP1, so at the start of the weekend. And he basically, Albon, big crash, standard stuff. But then it totally wrote off the car for the rest of the weekend. Williams came out and said that they won't be able to do the substantial repairs in time to be able to field Albon on the in qualifying or for the race. And instead of that being game over for Alex Albon's weekend, they just pushed aside Logan Sargeant and gave his car to Albon. Now, I was appalled by this decision personally. I think if a driver makes an error that costs them the car for the weekend, they should not be able to drive for the rest of the weekend. And I think literally everyone else apart from Williams on the planet would agree with me there. Does anyone think Williams made the right decision?
I think in a performance point of view, I think yes, I do think it is the right decision. But in terms of maybe performance going forward, in terms of the whole team atmosphere going forward, no, I think that it's overall net negative decision. I think for Williams, I do think that ultimately they should have given Logan. Obviously, in hindsight as well, it's a lot easier to say because Albon didn't get any points. Maybe if he had got a point, then yes, you'd be looking at it and go, yeah, it was the right decision. But either way, I mean, it's not good for Sargeant going forward. It's not good for the team atmosphere going forward. And I do think that, ultimately it was the wrong decision.
I think what could that do to Sargeant's confidence as well? This is a guy who's shown moments of some sort of promise, but hasn't really made a lasting impact in his short time in F1 at the moment. And points are few and far between for him, and he's not had a great start to this season. And the team, when his teammate makes a huge mistake, basically go and say, right, you're now going to suffer as a result of that. And it's a case of as well, they didn't even think, could Albon do that again? Do you know what I mean? If he's making that kind of mistake in the first place, maybe he's just not in good form that weekend. Now, was Sargeant going to score points for Williams considering Albon failed to do so and, Albon is regarded as the better driver? I doubt it. It probably would have been a pretty bog standard weekend for Logan Sargeant regardless, but it's still totally unfair. I mean, Amy, what are your thoughts on the matter?
I just don't understand how Logan's being punished for a mistake that Alex made. I mean, I really like Alex, and I think he's an incredible driver. But for me, I really wanted Alex to crash again, and I know that's awful, but he almost did in Q1 as well, coming out in that opening lap. But it's just really poor from Williams, and I really like James Vowles and how he's managing that team, but that was the wrong decision to make. And I'm not even sure what's going to happen for Japan, because isn't a part still not going to be there?
And also, if they crash again in Japan, they still don't have a spare chassis to go to, so they will have one driver if they have any incidents, which means surely they're not going to be able to push as much. I know, obviously, drivers aren't pushing with the intention that they could crash anyway, but still, when there's even more on the line, when there's more on the line, I mean, even if it's just some sort of psychological thing, they're just not going to push to the absolute limit. So I think it's also on the team, isn't it, for not having a spare chassis. And that's what James Vowles focused on, is that it's not, the error isn't that we made the wrong decision in terms of choosing Alex. It was the decision that we didn't have a spare chassis, and that showed how far behind they are. But still, I think they could have handled it better.
Yeah, it was a weird one, because again, I'm a huge fan of James Vowles as well. I like what he's done at Williams so far. I like how he operates. But this really was, I think, a little bit unfair on Logan Sargeant. Just for Albon to have a totally mediocre weekend after that as well. No points for the team, despite the fact that both Haas's finished in the points as well. But you could argue, I'll give him a little shout out as well, because Haas have been substantially better than what we all anticipated at the start of the season. I remember when we were looking back at I looked back at the livery rankings that we did, and sort of just concluded that Haas car just had 10th in the championship written all over it. But you know what? They've done an exceptional job, both drivers, to put on not only entertainment but bring some points home for the team as well. But like I was saying, no points for Albon, despite the fact that competitors, even RB, were capitalising on chaos elsewhere on the grid to finish in points-paying positions, and nothing for Williams, despite the fact that they made a bold decision to swap the drivers round. But we'll move away from that and talk about, again, friction within the team. I briefly touched on them just then, but RB, and it has been rumoured that Daniel Ricciardo has been given an ultimatum, probably by Helmut Marko, much like what Nick de Vries was given at the sort of, maybe not this point last year, but at a similar time last year. And basically, if Daniel doesn't perform in the next few races, then they will sub in Liam Lawson, who they have had conclusive proof. They've had maybe just enough proof to sort of affirm the fact that he is worthy and ready for an F1 seat. Amy, what do you make of this? Because, you'll probably just use the washed word again, won't you, really? Is that your sort of verdict on Ricciardo now?
I don't know now. I really don't. I think this ultimatum will, go one of two ways, like everything does, I guess. It'll either make him or break him. I think he does work under pressure, but for me, this kind of exposes Daniel that, McLaren weren't actually the bad ones to him in a way. Maybe he was just always, not been able to deliver since, the Renault days. And which is nice for me as a McLaren fan to know that, he was maybe the problem, not the team. I love Daniel, I do, and I never want to say a bad word about him. But he's come in, and I didn't think he had the best, time at AlphaTauri. Well, when they were AlphaTauri last season. Yeah. But then he's gone and proved it even further. And I predicted this at the beginning of the season, that I didn't think he was going to be able to, keep up with Yuki. I thought Yuki was going to be miles ahead of him, and he's proven that. But with Daniel, I do think he could potentially, use this pressure to, excel. But I don't think that is going to happen. But yeah, the fact that they've unfollowed each other on Instagram as well, Yuki and Daniel, I don't know what's gone on between them two, but it's never really been properly a friendship since joining. I mean, we heard the radio calls in Bahrain. So what was it, Bahrain or Saudi?
It was Bahrain when Ricciardo failed to pass Kevin Magnussen after team orders. It was it was pretty poor, that. And then, poor pace in Saudi Arabia, forgettable weekend at his home Grand Prix. If we look back to the De Vries ultimatum from last year very briefly, if Helmut Marko stuck to his word, he would have been gone by the Spanish Grand Prix. But no, it wasn't until whatever the race before Hungary was. I think that was Daniel's first race, wasn't it, the Hungarian Grand Prix? And so I think take what Helmut Marko or anyone at Red Bull says with a pinch of salt, especially in the case that this is Daniel Ricciardo we're talking about. Now, while Max Verstappen is their golden boy, Daniel Ricciardo is the favourite child, I think, of Red Bull, someone who they're desperate to promote back to the main team for one last dance. But it's looking ever unlikely, given not only is he performing badly, but Yuki's performing really well as other drivers outside of the Red Bull family. Seb, I'm just going to ask you straight up, do you reckon Ricciardo is gone by Belgium?
No, I don't think so. I do think that even though his performances haven't been amazing recently, they haven't been so bad. He hasn't been crashing the car. They haven't been terrible. But this weekend, I think, was just unlucky, really. Obviously, when you look at qualifying, knocked out in Q1, 18th on paper, that looks absolutely terrible. But he did have the pace to get into Q2, potentially Q3, we'll never know. Track limits, yes, it is on him, but ultimately the team have to look at, was the pace there in terms of that one lap? And yes, it was. He did have the pace to get into Q2, and he should have. And then, obviously, it comes to, it's a recovery drive, and he did okay. His race pace was okay. It was on a similar level-ish to Tsunoda. Obviously, he was a bit more in dirty air and things like that. So, yeah, it was hard for him to make a mark on the race, especially in a car that wasn't substantially quicker than those around him. But, yeah, he's got a lot of pressure on him now. It is make or break, and he hasn't got any choice other than to step up. And I think that, we haven't seen a lot from him to suggest that, yes, he's definitely going to make that step up. But there have still been positives. You do think back to Mexico last year. Yes, we weren't able to see what Yuki was properly able to do that race. But still, Ricciardo was able to put it into P4 in qualifying, convert it into P7 in the race. And there are still signs that he could potentially step up. I do think it makes it, this start to the year does make it a lot less likely that he is going to make that step up to the Red Bull seat, as we, you and I predicted. Obviously, Amy didn't, and that looks like it's going to come true. Because, Tsunoda's doing such a good job, and Ricciardo really did have to massively outperform if he was going to get there, at least be on a similar level to him. And then obviously Sainz stepping up, I think it makes it a lot less likely that Ricciardo's there. But we do have to take into account Horner is still at Red Bull, and it doesn't, that's sort of been swept under the rug now. And Horner is a big fan of Ricciardo, so I don't think they're going to treat him as harshly as they did De Vries, even if arguably it could be deserved.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to delve into, really, with it, isn't there? It's a case of, as well, though, you do bring up the fact that, he does have these moments like we had, like you mentioned in Mexico. It was a really promising performance, great qualifying session in particular. But it's a case of you don't lose, all of what drivers in that sort of echelon as Daniel Ricciardo, you don't lose all the talent that you've got, just despite the fact that, you're putting in poor performances. Sure, your talent does wither away, especially with age and with, moving around loads of different teams with pretty poor cars. But you look back to his McLaren days, sure, McLaren, he wasn't good enough, but he still won a race. Think of, as well, his a Red Bull counterpart of his, Sebastian Vettel, towards the end of his career. Think of that last season in Ferrari where the car was really bad and Charles was much better than him. Still got a podium in Istanbul. And so it's a case of, you can rely on Daniel for certain performances here and there to give yourself a good performance for maybe one weekend in 5, but will he have the consistency to sort of maintain that seat for him? Will Liam Lawson's sort of great cameo last year be enough to sort of provoke the big cheeses at Red Bull to make the swap? I mean, Amy, you were sort of turning your nose up at Seb, sort of suggesting the idea of Daniel getting better, and while Liam Lawson replacing him, which I think could happen, jeopardises my pre-season predictions, I'm not going to try and deny it and say that it isn't on the cards. Do you think that Lawson will make the sort of switch with Ricciardo at some point this year?
Yeah, I do now a little. I mean, I'm very surprised, but also happy that Red Bull are going to give potentially a younger driver a chance. They're not going to put in an older driver. Like, Daniel Ricciardo's 33 years old. Like, now, like, he's an old man. And, Liam Lawson deserved that, I think. And, him and Yuki would be a great pairing. And I think it gives, Liam the chance to prove this season that he could potentially even go and get that second Red Bull seat. But with Daniel Ricciardo, it's just so much should have, would have, could have. Like, moments don't last, and that's been shown. Yeah, he won a race at McLaren, but that weren't enough. Lando was so consistent and did so much better than him over 2 whole seasons that was the reason he was sacked again. He could have gone and got into Q2, but he didn't. And, like, that's just my point with Daniel. Like, yeah, he could have and he should have done this, but he's not, and until he proves that he can. And hopefully, I do hope in a way, because I do like, he's a lovely guy, but you can't just be a likeable guy. And I'm glad that Red Bull aren't just being like, oh, he's good for marketing. No, they're putting Racing Bulls first, which is quite nice to see, especially when, they're the second team. They actually want to, do well with this team now that there's a bit more money into it, and hopefully get the best driver lineup is going to be 2 young drivers in Yuki and Liam. So.
Yeah, I mean, I remember you saying sort of in our predictions video before the weekend, Seb and I were saying he's due a good result, it's going to happen. And then you were basically, in fairness, you look like a genius now. Why? Why is he due a good result? And it's a very good point. He's got to go and earn it. It doesn't come sort of out of fortune. He's got to put in the performances himself. Speaking of predictions, let's react to our pre-race weekend predictions now. I think this will be a one for the ages, because there's just sort of been... it was it was an interesting one looking back on it. So for those of you new around here, a lot of our episodes are very much based on the predictions that we make, whether that's at the start of the season or before a race weekend. We've got a leaderboard as well, and we can earn points depending on how many predictions we get correct in multiple different categories. We'll go through them one by one, getting a point for, like I said before, each correct prediction. So we'll start off with who we predicted to finish on pole position. Seb and I get a point each, as we both said Max Verstappen. It looked inevitable from the start of the race weekend, really. It did, as I said before, it did take a while for Red Bull to find that sweet spot for Max's setup. But, once he's in gear, 0.3 clear of the rest of the field, it was a convincing pole position for Max Verstappen. Amy, you said Charles Leclerc. Any thoughts on that?
He should have had a better qualifying than that. Not pole position, maybe, but maybe he should have been where Sainz was. The Ferrari clearly had pace this weekend, so... For me, it was quite a disappointing one for Charles, but it was P5 in the end after Checo's penalty behind a McLaren, which actually is a bit of a stink, I can't lie. But I'll never speak about Charles like that. He was still fast, and he was able to get P2 in the race, but he went pole position material this weekend.
Seb, anything to add to that?
No, I think obviously he wasn't able to get that final run in. I'm not really sure why. But yeah, he did say about obviously Red Bull taking a while. And Max said afterwards actually that, he came into qualifying not expecting to actually be challenging for pole position, and then to be, 0.3 ahead of the rest. It just shows that, he is still... And people don't really go on about his 1 lap pace as much. They do say about, Charles is the best over 1 lap and things like that. But Max over 1 lap is still... I think the best driver on the grid, and I think he's proven that.
Yeah, if we look back to Saudi Arabia as well, that lap that he put in for pole position, we did sort of make reference to it. It was better than that lap that he almost had in 2021, which many people regard as one of the biggest what-ifs in recent F1 history. He is just flawless. He's a flawless driver, and that translates to his pole position efforts, which are more often than not very, very successful. So yeah, a point each for me and Seb for Max Verstappen getting pole there. But just because he finished on pole position doesn't necessarily make him the star of qualifying, which is our next category. Now, Seb, you sort of assessed these and graded them, and you gave Amy the point for saying Oscar Piastri. Now, I said Esteban Ocon, you said Daniel Ricciardo, which, the latter certainly not the star by any means. But explain your decision in giving Oscar the sort of point for that.
I think, obviously, being his home race, there was a lot of pressure on him, and, to qualify where he did, it was decent enough. He wasn't miles off the pace in terms of Norris, and we do. I think all of us think that Norris is better over 1 lap than Piastri. And yeah, it was quality. It was the most he could have done. I think that it was just comparing that to Ocon, and obviously Ocon's got a good shout because he did get into Q2 in the Alpine, and on paper they didn't bring any upgrades, things like that. But when I think about the context, when I think about that, he did outqualify Gasly, but I just look at how the pace was between the two going into that final run. Gasly was quite far ahead, and Ocon did pull out the bag, but Gasly wasn't able to, again, for the third week running, not able to get in a third flying lap when it actually matters with obviously the track evolution, things like that. And so I do think both of them would have got into Q2. So I don't think it was as impressive as it looked from Ocon. But it's still, it's still what you do, get close to the ceiling of the car. So it was still impressive from him. But I do think Piastri, with the pressure of it being his home race, I think just about, for me, out of the three we chose, was star qualifying.
Bit of bitterness from Sam Wilson there. But
I'm not going to argue it.
Let's all sort of conclude as well that Daniel Ricciardo definitely not the star of qualifying. More than, sorry Sam, I'm rubbing it in a bit, but over half a second to Yuki Tsunoda in Q1. I mean, that is an unforgivable sort of gap between the two drivers. But have we got a sort of definitive star of qualifying that maybe didn't make our predictions? Looking through the starting grid now, I'm leaning towards Yuki Tsunoda as sort of the star of qualifying that we didn't predict. Anyone else got any other shouts?
Yeah. Carlos Sainz, is definitely when you think about, obviously with the appendix, things like that, and the race win obviously will take precedent, and you look at that as the more impressive feat, but still, P2, clear of obviously Leclerc, Norris, I think it's still really impressive. It wasn't quite on the pace of Verstappen. Arguably, you could say Verstappen style qualifying as well, actually. I think that was really good from him. But I think Tsunoda I'd definitely agree with.
So Amy picking up the point there for the start of qualifying. Let's flip it totally on its head now and award the flop of qualifying. And Amy, I think you've got it right. I mean, Seb's giving you the point on the spreadsheet here, but Daniel Ricciardo being the flop of qualifying, I think I have to agree. Even though it wasn't what I predicted, I said Lance Stroll, and looking back on that, I look like a bit of a mug. But Seb, I mean, you said Carlos Sainz. So we've both had two absolute howlers there. But Amy, Daniel Ricciardo, that's probably the right pick. As I said before, more than half a second to Yuki Tsunoda.
I should be getting minus points, I think, on these predictions.
Can you afford minus points, Seb, with how you do
I was a little worried when he, did get out of, the bottom four in Q1. But luckily that was track limits and he went straight back down. I was a bit like, I've underestimated him here. But
I was thinking my shot prediction, oh my God, it's actually got a chance, as we'll look at later. I was like, yes, Ricciardo getting into that top 10 in Q1 he was.
But I mean, not only was it a huge gap between Tsunoda and Q1, Yuki made it all the way to Q3, outqualifying both Aston Martins, outqualifying Lewis Hamilton, outqualifying his rivals in the midfield like the Haas cars and Albon and Bottas. He did a phenomenal job in qualifying, sort of assuring the fact that Daniel probably was the worst of that session. Maybe a sort of look-in for Lewis Hamilton there, failing to make Q3, although it was pretty marginal in the end. So I think we can sort of let that slide. And Amy picks up the point there. Maybe another flop as well, Fernando Alonso, another sort of half-second gap to his teammate there. But it was just a pretty troublesome session. Let's move on to the podium now. So we get a point each for every correct podium prediction. So I said Max to finish first, which obviously didn't happen. Leclerc to finish P2, which obviously did happen. And then who did I have in P3? I had George Russell in P3, which looks like a pretty silly prediction. And the only other point that was on the board from this as well was Seb picking up a point for predicting Lando Norris to successfully finish in P3. Amy, you had him down in P2 with Piastri in P3. Talk us through that prediction there.
Yeah, I didn't think the Ferraris were going to be as fast as the McLarens. I thought McLaren was going to be the second fastest team, obviously, without the Red Bulls there. But Max was out, so obviously Max first, and then but in real life, Carlos Sainz was the fastest overall, and then didn't think Charles Leclerc would be above Norris in this race, especially with Norris out qualifying him. So, but yeah, shocked us all. Got ahead, and the Ferraris were something else, honestly. Yeah. So Piastri just missing out. I mean, if I had known Max was going to DNF, I would have been maybe had my sensible hat on and had Leclerc somewhere there. But yeah, I don't think I would have ever predicted that
I mean,
podium.
I for one was sceptical of Ferrari's performance going into this weekend. One thing that I made reference to, and we've all sort of acknowledged as well, was the difficulties they've had in the first 2 races of getting their tyres in the right operating window. And Australia is notoriously a very hard track to do that around, but everyone had issues with it, which sort of leveled the playing field for Ferrari a bit, and so they were able to flex their muscles a bit. And now everyone's sort of, undergoing similar problems to them. The pace of their car, really sort of came out to play a little bit, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, decent. Obviously, getting the 1-2, a decent Sunday to say the least for Ferrari. But yeah, Seb. Perez, Peter, I mean, there's nothing really much else to say. Just an underwhelming race from Checo Perez. He was pretty slow. Anything to add to your prediction for the podium?
Yeah, obviously we talked about the fact that, he apparently had floor damage according to Christian Horner. Do we think that's true? Probably, but did that affect his performance, to the extent that it did? Probably not. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think any of us really would have predicted that Red Bull would have had the weekend that they did. So I'm not mad at this. Compared to some of my other ones, I'm okay with my predictions here.
Now, moving on to the next category now. Seb hasn't actually graded it yet, so I think we've got some debate coming your way. It is Driver of the Day for Sunday. Now, Carlos Sainz won the vote from the fans in the race itself, and I said George Russell, so let's get that out of the way and just completely nullify that and just remove it from any debate. Amy said Lando Norris, and Seb said Nico Hulkenburg. 2 candidates definitely worthy of Driver of the Day. Do either of you sort of agree or disagree with your predictions? Who are you both saying there was the Driver of the Day on Sunday out of those 2?
I want to say Hulkenberg. I think obviously there's the argument that yes, Norris came second in the actual vote, but that's because he's Lando Norris and everyone loves him for some reason, and he got on the podium. But what I think, when you look at the actual performance of the McLaren, he should have finished where he did. It wasn't particularly outstanding.
He weren't outdone by his teammate.
Well, he required team orders to do it as well.
Orders, but he would have got past him. Just didn't want any fighting, and he went and delivered a podium, his first podium of the year.
I think
don't see any podiums for Nico Hulkenberg, do we?
Ooh.
But I think finishing, I think in the points for Haas 2 weeks in a running, obviously, you can't take into it, the last race weekend, but still finishing P9, I think that is the best of what he could have done.
Starting P16 as well. Really
exactly.
Sort of
I know. Yeah, he was lucky, obviously, with the VSC, but again, that's on him. He was able to pit at the right time. He was able to make his tyres last in a reasonable, get with reasonable degradation until the VSC, take advantage of that. And yeah, I think going from P16 to P9 in a Haas, in my opinion, and it might also be because I predicted it, is more impressive than Lando Norris.
I don't think we'll ever reach an answer for this.
Well, the reason I'm pushing this so hard is because I can equal points with you on this, Rudy. So
yeah, that's what I was just about to say. I can't really be the sort of unbiased adjudicator of this because it's very tight at the top of the leaderboard for them.
That means you think Hulkenberg, yeah?
Well, to be fair, I am leaning towards Hulkenberg, Seb. I do like what you have to say in terms of it's maybe a more impressive feat that he did manage to finish, 7 positions gained in the end in a Haas as well. But obviously a Haas that looked pretty good on the Sunday. Of course, K-Mag finishing P10 can't, they
were both just as good as each other. It's just like the 2 McLarens. It's really the same story, but they just finished lower. And the only reason the other Haas got a point was because of George Russell doing nothing. Very true, very true.
It would have been P10 for Hulkenberg. It would have. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it was a very good drive.
He still would have got a point. With Russell.
How many did Lando get?
That meme of Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank sat in the Sky Sports studio, just like, I can't remember who's arguing. I think it must be Jamie Carragher and Gary Neville. But I just feel like Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank right now, just smiling away.
I just don't want to give it
watching you two shout at each other. But I think the definitive driver of the day was Carlos Sainz. We can all agree that he was the driver of the day on Sunday. But
and he went flop. He went flop. So
that doesn't come into it. That doesn't come into it.
That's irrelevant.
Actually, no. You predicted Norris to finish P2 and he under-delivered.
And did
There we go. There we go.
No,
I don't think we're going to
I'm not
reach an
having
agreement.
I predicted him P3, and
I
he just
predicted
performed to
McLaren
my
team of the week,
expectations.
so they actually delivered.
Yeah, but if they were team of the week, he should have won then. There you go.
I don't think we'll ever come to an agreement on this. Fingers crossed this podcast does well, and we can have a poll somewhere in the video or maybe on a particular social media
Justice
site.
for Hulkenberg.
Can you get polls on YouTube videos? I'm pretty sure you can. In the
I
comments.
don't think you can anymore.
We certainly used to. But that's just rumour.
Can we both have the point?
Oh,
Yeah, I
you
think-
know what?
yeah.
Okay,
Do you
yeah.
know
Instead of
what?
doing that,
I'm-
let's give you
I'm
both
happy
the
with
point
that.
then. Let's give you both the point. So a point for Lando Norris and a point for Nico Hulkenberg for Seb and Amy, respectively.
If he
Now-
hadn't got a podium, if he got P4, I would have given it, yeah. But a podium.
Yeah, no, fair enough. It was a solid drive from him as well. Didn't really have any complaints throughout the whole of Sunday. Let's move on to something that I think we can be able to sort of agree on pretty easily now. The flop of the, I think flop of the weekend, flop of the day. Yeah, it's flop of the weekend, isn't it? That's what we have as that. It just says flop on the spreadsheet here, but
I never know what that is. I never know where it's flop of the race.
yeah. That doesn't change the fact that you put Charles Leclerc, and no matter what the context is, that is incorrect.
Beaten convincingly by his teammate. That's
He
what I
was, but he was fine. Ferrari won too. You can't say he was the flop. Amy and I both said Lewis Hamilton, and Amy and I think, definitely getting the point for that. Now, obviously, the DNF on the Sunday definitely wasn't his fault, but it wouldn't have been a weekend to remember for him anyway. I think that pace wasn't convincing on Saturday, failing to make Q3. George Russell, okay, sure, he DNF from the race, but he was really strong over the course of the weekend. I think it was a solid enough drive from Russell to maybe give Hamilton that flop of the weekend award anyway, if he were to go on and complete the race. But yeah, a point each for Amy and myself as we both put Lewis Hamilton. Seb with none for the shout of Charles Leclerc.
Anyone who speaks badly about Charles Leclerc will fall.
Yeah.
Will fall.
So I think we can all agree that the best team was Ferrari, finishing in the sort of 1-2 spot after Max Verstappen's DNF, capitalising really well on sort of unforeseen circumstances. Out of McLaren and RB as well, I think we can all agree that McLaren were better as a team than RB this weekend. A 3-4 for McLaren, really positive result, and only 1 points finish for Tsunoda, who proved that the car was worthy to be finishing in that top 10, and Daniel Ricciardo not providing the result required for a double points finish. Seb, I mean, you sort of look like you want to disagree here, but I think you're just trying to salvage a point. Sure.
Well, all I'd say is that RB, I think, relative to the context around them, I think it's more important this weekend for them getting a P7. When you think about how close midfield is, it moves them up to P6. And I think that, yeah, ultimately, I do think McLaren as a team had a better weekend, but that individual result from Tsunoda, I do think it puts RB up there for one of the teams that has had the better weekend sort of thing. So I think it would be Haas, McLaren, Ferrari and RB, I think, are the four teams that have had the best weekend. So,
Well, you should have put Yuki Tsunoda for driver of your day then, because you got a point.
But I think you did just say then that McLaren had a better weekend, and that's what the category is based on. So I get what you're trying to say, but by sort of dictionary definition, by the loose rules that we have surrounding our predictions, I think by sort of, I think objectively McLaren were better than RB. So that's a point there for myself and Amy. And then finally, our shock predictions, none of which coming true. I said Esteban Ocon nearly making it to Q3. Amy said Kevin Magnussen to reach Q3. And Seb said both RBs to make it to Q3. So no shock prediction points there. Amy, what was your sort of little finger wag?
I was just like, wondered.
Did it?
Didn't Yuki get to Q3?
yeah, but
the
I said
prediction was
both would,
both of them.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Oh,
Shame.
and I think that if I just said Yuki to get to Q3, he got it the week before, it probably wouldn't have been exactly a shock. But
Yeah.
I mean, it was close. I think they could have. I think that if Ricciardo hadn't had the track limits thing, I know it's a could have again, but I think there was an opportunity for that. But still, yeah.
I mean, I just wish I went for my max DNF, which I went for last week in Saudi, but that would have been incredible. But it is what it is. No, I don't do it to maybe, so.
Right, let's just tot up the scores now that everyone has earned themselves after this Grand Prix. I think I'm on 14 points now because I started off with 10. And then I got 4 from Max Pole, Leclerc P2, Hamilton Flop, and McLaren Best Team. Amy, you were the best scorer of this weekend. That's 5 points for you, putting you also on 14 points. I'm doing this very much sort of playing it by ear here, but yeah, you are tied with me on points at the top now. And then 3 points for Seb this weekend, putting him on a grand total of 7 after the first 3 rounds. Although, Seb, you are still a little bit behind. This was your best performing weekend predictions-wise, so something to be proud of there. At least it's on the up. It's on the up, but I suppose the only way was up after Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. But that's it, I think, for Australian Grand Prix predictions review and just review of the whole weekend in general. Do stick around as we've got some more content coming out between now and the Japanese Grand Prix in just under 2 weeks' time. We'll, of course, be doing Japanese Grand Prix content as well, previewing it, predictions, and then obviously reviewing it and reacting to the predictions as per the use. So yeah, thank you very much for tuning in, whether that's on YouTube or Spotify. Make sure, or other listening platforms as well. Make sure to check out our socials, TikTok, Instagram, anything you like. If you've not seen it yet, make sure to check it out. Thank you to Seb and Amy for joining me once again. And yeah, do stick around on YouTube in particular. That's where most of our content is going to be coming out soon. And yeah, thanks for watching. Goodbye.
Bye.